Oh, looks shorter. Oh, okay. Yeah. 26. Dude, this week is gone. I thought it was Wednesday the entire day. Nope. You gotta rehab your sleep schedule before finals, man. Get some rest in there.
I don't think it's like.
Oh yeah, I was so stressed because I'm a bunch of shit. It's like it's not even class stuff. It's like all out of stuff. But I was so stressed out that I woke up an hour early.
Yeah.
Just automatically, man. Should never happen.
Yeah.
I had so much to do.
He's like there.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
Again, I don't want to get up, but I mean, I'm up.
Oh, okay.
Bless you.
Yeah.
Did you watch the Nest?
I am. No,
Oh my God, bro. It was. Dude, the entire time I was praying on Katie's downfall, my prayers were answered, bro. They were answered. And now, are you focused? Just the Bucks fan? I love Young. Like what? Yeah. You ready to get absolutely destroyed? I don't know. Hey, Bucks is forever and always, right? See, the good thing about being a Bucks fan is if we go down 3-2, I'm not going to be worried. What I am going to be worried is if we go down, I'm going to be like, I don't know. There's no, man, there's no. Let's see, look, if there's anyone that can lose, the first that can really lose.
Well, they're hyper, they're linked.
Yeah.
Right, but you don't have to. Yeah, because you got all the numbers.
I'm just kind of sad that.
Yeah, or actually.
Why do you hate Chris Paul? I don't think I've ever heard someone say that. He's what Grayson really? Hey man, Jose Alvarado. I think he was going to be good when I saw him in the ACC. And he was going. Little man, he's what, like 6'1".
Okay, so these are right. The way they're written out.
All right. Happy last day of this class. How are we doing? That's it. Yeah, there we go. Nice. Thank you. Do to your fingers.
Oh, I broke it actually. It's not
No. Sorry. Breaking fingers hurts. Breaking fingers hurts.
Yeah.
I've actually broken every one of my fingers except for my thumbs.
Somebody told me that last night, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So.
No. Various ways.
It's not all the time.
No, no. I've also broken my nose 3 times, which also hurts really badly. Anybody hasn't done it. Anyhow, anybody have any announcements? No. A couple of quick course-related things. Remember that your final paper draft is due tonight, unless you've made other arrangements. Please get those turned in. We will make sure to have all grades that we possibly can in before the final exam, so that you know where you sit before you have to take it. Not that I'm advising that you study less if you're doing really well or something like that. Remember that the final exam is going to be in here May 5th at noon. I posted a study guide this morning, so it's up there. We'll be doing a review session on May 4th. I believe we decided on 2 o'clock. Somebody can correct me if that's wrong. And it will most likely just be via Zoom. I think that's just the easiest way for it to work for everybody. I will record it and I'll post it as soon as it's done. So that if you can't make it, you guys can go back and check it out that night when you're actually studying. I did post a couple more practice cost benefit questions for Sakai, and in a separate document, the answers. So those are there for you to work on if you want to. Remember that there is the extra credit cost benefit assignment where you get to write your own cost benefit question. That you can turn that in on Sakai. Remember that you have to turn in both the question and the answer. And what I'm looking for are questions that are testing sort of multiple concepts, not something that's like super basic and easy. I will pick one of those questions and put it on your final exam. Okay. Yes.
Sorry, so that's just one question, right? Like just one.
Just one question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So final exam. Oh, another question.
Do you just want the answer, or do you want it to be like ABC options?
No, I want it to be like a short answer kind of question.
Yeah, on paper.
The exam will be on paper. Actually, exactly what I was about to say. I will print out the exams and bring them in here. You will put all of your answers on the exam itself. It will be a combo, multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank, and then short answer. The majority of the points in the exam will come from the short answers, but there still will be a substantial chunk from the multiple choice, true, false section. I haven't decided exactly what those percentages are yet because I haven't written it totally yet. But I give you at least a range on the study guide as to what they may be. Yeah.
Sorry if you already answered this. I was just looking at the final exam study guide, but is this cumulative or is it just the second half of the class?
It's just the second half of class.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on the exam?
We don't need any scantrons or blue books or anything.
No Scantrons, no blue books. You do want to bring a calculator. And one that does scientific, like a scientific calculator. Okay. Well, what I would like to do today is just take a little bit and talk very, very briefly about policy diffusion. I have an entire sort of slide deck up here that gives you different theories about policy diffusion. I decided I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It's too nice a day for right now. And as I was doing this lecture in the last class, everyone just kind of like zoned out, and I decided I couldn't take that twice in a day. But I want to go through a couple of highlights of what I think is particularly important about policy diffusion. And then if there are more questions, you can ask questions, and otherwise we can wrap it up early and you can get outside for a little bit before it starts raining. Sound good? Okay. So when we think about policy diffusion, this is one of the few areas in terms of policy research where there's a decent amount of theoretical literature out there. There is this fundamental divide, as academics are wont to do, just in terms of the definition of what we mean by diffusion. From my perspective, it basically just means how policy ideas or policies themselves spread from one government to another. It doesn't necessarily mean from the US government to the French government, right? It could be from North Carolina to Oklahoma. It could be from Idaho, right, to Rowan County. You like that, Aaron? You know, so just different levels of government, different governments, just generally speaking. Okay. Another definition that's very common in the literature is this: one government's policy choices being influenced by the choices of other governments. What strikes you as being different about these two definitions? Why might I prefer one over the other? Maybe is a better way to frame it. Well, there's a key word in the second one that's not in the first one. What's that word? Influenced, absolutely. Right? This sort of suggests an element of coercion, or at least a conscious attempt, right, to manipulate another government, another governmental entity into doing a particular thing. I think that is a part of policy diffusion, but I don't think that is necessary for it to be included under the umbrella of diffusion. And as I go through some of the basic diffusion theories, I think you'll see why that is. One of the oldest theories out there is this basic notion of geographic clustering, okay, where you're going to get similar policies adopted within regions. A lot of this had to do originally with what you're actually able to observe. Right? So if I'm hanging out here in Chapel Hill, I can observe, you know, what's going on in Chapel Hill or Carrboro or Durham or Raleigh. Right, but I'm probably not going to be able to know exactly what's going on in Portland, Oregon. And so the realm of policy options that we have to draw from is somewhat limited by our geographic location. Now, that, of course, has changed, where we have communication technology and other things that allow us to observe all over the world. And from a diffusion point of view, this is both positive and negative. It's positive in that we have a lot more choices available to us. Okay. the sample has increased, I guess. Or maybe the population of interest has increased. The problem with that is places are different. And the bottom line is that context matters when it comes to policy. And so we can't just adopt a policy that works in Sri Lanka and apply it in Scarborough. Yeah. Even though the temptation may be there because we are able to see all of these things. There's a lot of examples of geographic clustering, especially historically, but I just want to point out that it is still relevant. Despite the technological changes and our advances in communication, we do see these regional clusters of policies. I think the South in general is just an example. You can look at their COVID policies, right? That's clearly, you know, there's something generally unique about the South when it comes to their approach to COVID. And that's actually even excluding Florida, which isn't really part of the South. It's just Florida. You see it more recently with sort of a spate of new anti-abortion laws, both in the South and what I call the lower Midwest, which tends to have a similar policy outlook or portfolio. And a lot of geographic clustering really is centered around the idea of cultural similarities. Sorry, I can't talk all of a sudden. And so it makes sense that policies in the South would differ from those in the Northeast, would differ from those in the Southwest, okay? Because there are significant cultural differences. So you do still see some level of geographic clustering, even though we have this ability, again, to observe what's going on worldwide. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is competition. And this one is pretty interesting. But basically what we see happening is states, cities, counties, regions are often competing for resources. Sometimes those resources are people or jobs. Sometimes they're natural resources like water. So speaking of Florida, there's been this long-standing dispute between Florida, Georgia, and Alabama over water. But this competition often drives them to have similar policies, but that they're trying to outdo each other. Yeah. So this is really based from a theoretical perspective on, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. I've always said it Tibu, but that could be totally wrong. If anybody wants to tell me exactly how it's pronounced. This notion of people voting with their feet, right? Of moving to places that have policy portfolios that are more in line with how they want to live. Couple of examples, tax credits, I think, are the classic example of competition. You know, we just, not just, I mean, it's been a while since they announced it, but, you know, Research Triangle Park is getting a new Apple complex. I don't know exactly what they're going to do there. I just know it's Apple, right? And it's not like Apple just randomly chose RTP because it's such a cool place, right? What happens is RTP and other places across the country engaged in a competition to lure them. And one of the ways they do this is by offering tax credits to lower the tax burden. Yes.
I actually did a project on the Research Triangle Park.
Oh yeah.
And we have the lowest business taxes in the entire country, the Research Triangle Park does. And so that's why we've seen such a huge boom for tech companies, because it's becoming more financially viable for them to start or move their stuff to places like the Research Triangle Park than to keep them in Silicon Valley.
That's fascinating. So if you couldn't hear that, RTP apparently has the lowest business taxes in the country. At least, I don't know how they swing that.
It's property, corporate income, and then there's a couple more like other smaller taxes that they
Yeah.
put all that together.
Put it all together and it's the lowest in the country. Well, see, that's all competition, right? It's not like it just so happens that we have the lowest tax thing, you know, in the country. It's to try to attract people. It's to compete with Silicon Valley. And look, sometimes this works out pretty well. The problem is you engage in this competition, and often what happens is you dole out these tax credits and other things, and whoever comes ends up failing. So we saw this in Greensboro sometime within the last 10 years. I can't remember exactly when it was, with Dell. And Dell, anybody from Greensboro know about this? Dell opened up a new office space, I think a manufacturing space outside of Greensboro, and they promised all these new jobs and they received all these tax credits, and they were shut down within 2 years. Yeah, so sometimes this competition really isn't helpful. It can actually be harmful. Lottery is another sort of classic example. It took a long time for North Carolina to get a lottery. Virginia had one for a long time before us. South Carolina had one. At some point, this notion of competing for revenue becomes important. And the state essentially says, we're just giving up revenue to these other states, and so we'll might as well just do a lottery. So Alabama is holding firm on this. No lottery, in case you're curious. So part of what I'm describing could be described as a race to the bottom. This notion that we're going to sort of bottom out in terms of the tax credits, it's going to bankrupt us, you know, that kind of thing. But there's other aspects to this that are particularly focused on welfare policies. And that's where this theory of race to the bottom got its origin in the literature of places wanting to avoid becoming what are called welfare magnets. And the idea is that people will move somewhere because they can get all kinds of benefits as opposed to wherever they're living now. Now, research has showed that people don't really do this, but it's been a powerful political message for a long time that places want to avoid being attractive to, in this case, the bottom echelons of society. I would say the evidence is at best mixed as to this actually occurring, but it is a very, very common diffusion theory. I think the race to the bottom idea is better thought of in tandem with competition than it is as a standalone theory. So, any questions so far? I think this is probably the last sort of big theory I want to talk about, and that's this notion of learning, right? That governments actually learn from each other, which you would think would be sort of the ideal scenario. Somebody enacts a policy, it works well, other places sort of copy it, yeah? And, you know, it comes out of this idea first sort of enunciated, at least publicly, by Justice Brandeis in a dissenting opinion in the Supreme Court, this notion of states as laboratories of democracy. And it's not just states. It can be city governments, county governments, school boards, what have you. But the federalist structure of our government allows us to use lower levels of governments to pilot policies, to test them out. and then we can learn from it. Okay? So in order to learn from it, we have to be able to evaluate these policies, and we have to be able to evaluate them well. And as you know, that is a difficult endeavor, but one that we can do so long as we set it up in advance. One of the things that the learning theory does is explicitly recognize that these other ideas, things like geographic clustering, things like competition, we admit that they're important. Okay, and they are a part of what happens when policies spread from one area to another. But we think learning is the primary aspect of what people are looking at. They're looking for effective policies to solve problems that are similar, right, within their jurisdictions. You do sometimes, though, get these conflicts between a policy being effective and politicians actually being willing to support it. You saw this with a lot of COVID policies, where we knew fairly straight away how effective masks and social distancing and that kind of thing was, but for political reasons, lots of areas just decided not to follow it. Yeah. One of the sort of best examples of learning within the federal structure is S-CHIPS. Anybody know what that stands for? It's a state child health insurance program. And I may not be totally right about those exact words, but it's the gist of it. But what happened was a lot of states who were being stingy about Medicaid because of their desire to avoid being a welfare magnet kind of realized they looked like jerks because they were excluding kids. And so they started these separate health insurance programs just for children, for low-income children. And it was wildly successful in terms of outcomes. And over time, other places began adopting it. They essentially began copying what they did. And now most, if not every state, has some form of an S-CHIP policy. Other things that you can look at are other experiments or pilot projects that are going on, whether that be in the soda tax realm, universal basic income. Those are the main ones that I know of right now. Anybody know of anything else? Yeah.
I think of like drug decriminalization or marijuana legalization.
Marijuana legalization, that's a good one. Yeah. And that's being done at state levels, right? Which is interesting. Okay. Which brings us to this notion of copying, of imitation. And when imitation actually is the result not of a desire to copy an effective policy, but is the result of some kind of coercion. Okay. And generally, we don't want that to happen. And we have to recognize that not all diffusion is good. Right? If it's a bad policy, we don't want it to spread. But what we see is that sometimes governments just want to be seen to be doing something, right? Could be because elections are coming up. Could be because they just don't know what else to do. Who knows? So it's important to understand the difference between imitation and coercion. Imitation, we see this all the time with things like, hey, let's build a new stadium to attract a sports team or to keep a sports team. Well, if 5 different cities build a new stadium to attract one sports team, 4 of those cities are going to be pretty upset when they don't get it. So imitation in and of itself may lead to a bad result. Coercion occurs when there is some kind of threat, be it an explicit threat or just something inherent in how the policy is adopted. That sort of changes the game a little bit. So you saw this with smoking policies. Probably the best example of coercion is the old drinking age thing, where several states had a drinking age of under 21. It was 18 to buy beer in Texas and some other places. And the federal government said, hey, we want everyone to be 21. Well, the federal government doesn't have the authority to actually say that, to have a national drinking age be 21. So what they did was they said, we will withhold highway funding from you. And the Supreme Court looked at this and said, they can do it. Right, that's okay. On the other side, though, you had the Affordable Care Act and its Medicaid expansion, where states that didn't expand were threatened with losing all of their Medicaid funding. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. That is overly coercive. So there are some limitations on what the federal government can do to coerce states into particular policies. What those limits are not entirely clear, but withholding all funding violates it. Yeah.
Is that good? Is there like a definite line that the Supreme Court
No.
uses there?
There is not a definite line.
Discretionary gray area.
Yeah. No. This next couple of slides, I'm just going to go through really quickly, if that's okay with you. Yeah. There's a couple of other things just to be aware of in terms of policy diffusion. One of the big ones is just different abilities, different capabilities, different levels of resources. It may be that a policy that works really well in one place is possible only because that place has high property taxes, or something along those lines, right? And so you always need to take into account these differing capabilities when you're looking at stuff. I really don't care if y'all know these things, so I'm not even going to talk about them. Are you upset about that? Sure. Pressure valve effect, doesn't that sound cool? I do want you to think about sort of the relationship between early adopters and late adopters. Just like with individuals, right? Some of us are early adopters of technology. Some of us like to wait and see. Which, on a random note, and this is exactly where I got off track in the last class, but that's okay. Did I tell y'all that my son won an Apple Watch at Frankie's Fun Park? Yeah, it was fantastic. It's the one on my wrist right now. Oh, my son is very lucky. I think he got it on his third try. $700 watch. Yes.
I went a trip to the Bahamas last year.
You went a trip to the Bahamas?
Bro.
At Frankie's?
No, not Frankie's.
The mall. Nice work. So you were also very lucky.
My name means good luck.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, just so you don't think I'm a total jerk, I didn't just take the watch from him. I traded him. I got the watch. He got my Beats. I think it's a fair trade. I mean, I won the trade. Anyhow. Other things to think about, elections are always important when it comes to policy adoption. There's all kinds of reasons why they might do something before election or not do something before an election. So just, keep that in the back of your mind. The stage of the policy process. So are we talking about adoption? Are we talking about implementation? Are we in already the evaluation phase? All of these things can have impacts on how easily things spread. When I think of policy diffusion, I really think about almost like COVID, right? Like the virus sort of spreading. And lots of times the sort of more natural way of things like that happening seems to be more accurate. Also, just think about characteristics of the policies. The more complex they are, right? The more difficult it is to transfer from one area to another. How compatible they are from a cultural perspective, from an institutional perspective, right? From an administrative perspective. If you don't have the same administrative capacity, you're not going to be able to do the same thing. Okay. How observable the effects are. This gets to a little bit like things like social acceptability and political feasibility. If people, like the general public, are aware that these policies exist and that they have these positive impacts, well, that makes it more likely to spread in other jurisdictions. We can also think in terms of relative advantage. If you want to go back to that part of the semester of specialization and trade and why some places may want to have certain policies and other places not have those policies. And then you've got to think about how easy it is to actually measure the effects. How easy it is to have a good evaluation of these so that we can know whether or not to adopt them. I did that really fast. Any questions? No. How fast I'm going to do this? It's actually, an interesting thought experiment if you are into such things, to really think about why we don't have more centralized policymaking in the United States. Because there are clear advantages to it, but there are also clear disadvantages. That to me is something that would be really fun to talk about if we could sit and actually talk about it. From just a pure factual point of view, I don't really care how well you know that. I just know it's on the slide. And I just want to say, that in the end, when it comes to policy diffusion, there isn't a clear answer on how it works. This is why this is still an active area of theoretical research in public policy. We don't, it's not a one size fits all type deal. I think you have to be aware of lots of different theories. You have to be aware of the context. If you're thinking about or trying to predict whether certain policies will spread, you need to be aware of a lot, if not all, of the stuff that I just talked about. It's also vital to understand that there are some things that we just can't predict. We have these exogenous shocks, right? Like COVID, like a new ideological majority on the Supreme Court, right? Which essentially is what makes all of these new anti-abortion laws possible. And so sometimes you just have to look at that. And we need to always remember that implementation of policy is just as important as adoption. Maybe not just as, but it's pretty close. We can adopt a policy and then we can sort of undermine it all the way as we're implementing it. And there's my big takeaway. Context matters. How many classes do you have where they say context matters or history matters? Yeah. It's one of those things though that's it's just true. So you might as well just accept it and move on to always think about those things. Any other questions? Yes. Do I know anything? So she's asking about the time period starting with the Reagan administration when you had a lot of what they called devolution of power from the federal government to the state governments. I think that plays into a lot of diffusion theory, especially when you're looking at states as laboratories. It also had a big part of the race to the bottom. As states became able to set their own eligibility requirements for various social welfare programs, that's when they started like competing essentially to not be the magnet. But I think a lot of these theories did change and become more applicable or less applicable after that. But honestly, the diffusion literature is newer. It really didn't start really taking hold from an academic point of view until probably the 90s, early 2000s. But that's a great question. Yeah.
Great question.
Uh-oh.
So, for instance, does that raise the budget? Is basically states want to reduce labor policies in order to avoid
Yeah, so the question is, states want to avoid welfare policies and therefore basically avoid poor people. Yes.
So that is what like raise the budget is about.
So I can't say this definitively, but there's certainly a relationship between this notion of race to the bottom and the idea of bottom feeders. Which is what essentially is a very, very pejorative, negative word for low income people.
Oh, and the second question
Yeah.
is, could you explain the relative again?
Relative advantage, right? That's when compared to so if you think about a company that's wanting to relocate. So when I was in graduate school, I worked for a professor who was like a consultant on the side. Have I told you this before? And he had a client who was a gun manufacturer, a Brazilian gun manufacturer, and they wanted to open up a new manufacturing plant in the United States because they were just starting to get into that market. And what they basically hired him to do, and then he hired me to do, was recommend, okay, where's the best place? And so I looked at things like tax credits, education systems, you know, these different sort of policy or aspects of areas. And yeah, that's like question one more time, then I'm gonna rephrase.
Explain relative advantage again.
Right, so relative advantage. So I can look at somewhere that has an established good school system, right? And I could recommend that place. I could look at a place that doesn't have an established good school system, but where they're willing to give them a ton of tax credits. Okay, and it may be that there's a relative advantage there in terms of what they can get, and then they can send their kids to private school.
It's about, it's like, considering
Yeah, essentially it was a cost benefit analysis question, right? Where's the place that we can get the most benefits? And it was also a race, kind of a race to the bottom, a competition type thing, because you had these different cities competing with each other by offering different levels of tax credits and other incentives. Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah.
So is this, the test is designed to be 3 hours or less than?
Totally changing topics.
So you're designed like.
The test is not designed to take 3 hours, the exam. So that's the question. How long is the exam designed for? The exam is designed for the average person to be done in 1 hour and 15 minutes. What that generally means is some people start turning it in about 45 minutes. Some people take the entire 3 hours. But I'm looking for the average, or maybe the median student, to turn it in at about 1:15, 1:30. I'm not going to give you the formulas on the exam. You have to memorize those. Any other questions?
Like sample answers for like the short response questions.
Sample answers for the short response questions. There are sample answers for the short response questions on all the problem sets.
Oh,
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we had a good turnout on the last day. Makes me happy. Yeah, so nice work to y'all. Thanks to everyone who's been coming fairly religiously. It's been a really weird semester, but I've still enjoyed it. And please remember to do your evaluations. They're due tomorrow night, I believe. And please do them for all your classes, not just mine. They do have some meaning. They have more meaning for me than they do for other people. And I can't, normally what happens is people either like a class or they really dislike a class. And those are the people who fill out evaluations. That is super unhelpful from a teaching perspective. Right? It doesn't really give me good sort of ideas as to how I can improve things. So that's why I want everybody to do it. It's not like it takes very long. If you can leave actual written comments, those are much more meaningful to me than the numbers that you get by filling in the bubbles. But yeah.
When do they close?
I think they close tomorrow night. Right? Don't they close on LDOC? I think. You may want to double check. All right, well, I hope you have a good LDOC. Don't give your professors a whole lot of trouble on LDOC. If you happen to be in a fraternity that's on frat court, make sure you get your permits right for tomorrow, because apparently there are some new professors who aren't a big fan of the 9 a.m. party. So just throw that out there.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Oh, that is
Where are you going?
Send me an email.
Yeah.
And, let's I would like to talk about it. For me, it doesn't matter.
So do you have any idea about what's
I mean, like, I'm not gonna. I don't have like. I mean.
Yeah, so for that.
So I teaching April 7th. And I did and I knew that you guys would get it. And so I just I just finished like all of my catch-up work. Actually, and so now, yeah. So, but I wanted to talk about
If I just change out like.
last night and asked them to talk about options.
If I change my road, like,
But I haven't want to talk
like,
about
this
whether
is
you're
right.
actually
This is
class
for-
like previous
This is just-
and so today, obviously, I'm not working. I wanted
So
to
you're
talk about what options
Like,
there
this
are.
is two.
Oh, really?
There are two options. So like,
I think about it.
It's hard to read.
if you want an actual grade.
If I'm having extra high,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, like. But I'm trying to think about like what.
Or deadline.
If I just correct things with that, I know. It does know it's a one liner.
So for the 1.51,
Like, if I just fix this.
that's already, that's all in there. I for every percentage are okay. I don't feel like the are rather.
But then,
That's the percentage of that. After you have all those, there's a 1.51% a design
But I know a lot of people.
whatever you want to do for your.
And that's how it just.
So the separate is.
It just-
good.
No, as soon as you finish, as soon as you turn
Yeah,
the
I
paper,
think the only
then I
thing
change
to do
it.
here is to add some just.
And that's it, and there's no permanent indication that it wasn't, that got changed.
Okay, so I can like, because I talk about really well.
I would focus on your exams,
Like reason
right? And then,
why you gave your.
you know, depending on what your summer plans are.
So I'm not
or if
saying
it's
the
first
current
week of
requirements.
summer, like how your policy is, and I'm happy to look at yours.
Yeah, because I've only done the first draft.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think
right?
as long as
So,
you
like,
add
that's me,
criteria and have one or two paragraphs using the criteria.
Do you want me to hear it? Should I?
And then things out.
And she's my.
Just use like 3 hours.
just email me.
Yeah, yeah, so I don't.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
sure, yeah, no problem.
For the woman?
Like something do every day, sure.
Yeah. I know.
And I'm for the restaurant.
Yeah. I did say.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much.
Is this the last thing I have to record?
Yeah. I should have.
It's just a
Will
point.
you send me an email?
Yeah. And like, it's online.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So actually, no. Oh, yeah.
Second question.
Uh-huh.
And at this point. You know, you're 25% chance of getting it. Okay, is that? So that would be 25. And then 50.
Right.
Okay.
So that should say 25.
Okay, that was very cool.
Thank you.
And then on the first one,
Oh, that's okay.
so
The interaction term is significant.
I see the benefits because you're seeing how much it would cost if we didn't have to down versus if we did. But then why does it cost did you do
Are these the numbers?
with the dam?
Yeah.
Why isn't it just like 10 for the cost instead of 15?
Because even with the dam, there's still expected.
So is this one not, this one still considered here? That one's
The
still.
potential to be like, no matter what, we have to deal with it. Okay, good. And then that second one.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
I
you.
really thought that I'd fix that. Because when I first wrote it, I had it that way and I was like.
And then you just.
And I went in and I changed it. I guess I didn't hit save. My post good.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have one yet, but I will. I'll build a forum on that. Yeah.
And then like.
Yes.
Why?
Hey.
So I had set up the.
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't do much research. But you're looking to get in.
Yeah, so I met with someone from research. She was very
What are you interested in?
so I'm planning to go to family law and try to be a judge. So I'm really into like, not